everything comes to the floor in such a hyper-partisan manner?
I would argue that it's already in the Constitution. We've overtaxed people. People like to legislate by emotion.
It's important to address when the governor oversteps his boundaries.
I'll pull up my pocket version here. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it. And welcome everybody for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. We're in the final stretch of the first special session of 2021, where we're hearing omnibus bills every day on the House floor, and we're joined again by Walter Hudson. Walter, thanks for joining. Go ahead and introduce yourself to the listeners.
Happy to be here as usual. I am a city council member in Albertville in the northwestern portion of the Twin Cities, just outside on what I consider to be the right side of the Crow River. And I'm a former commentator, had a talk show on Twin Cities News Talk for 3 years, and did some internet commentary with a couple of publications prior to that. And just love throwing in my 2 cents and listening to what you have to say.
Great. And I'm Jeremy Munson, state representative from District 23B, just south of Mankato, and have been in the legislature now just over 3 years. One episode before I said 5 years, that was wrong. 3 years ago. It's been a long 3 years, and love to do the podcast because I like to get into a little more detail on legislation than you can in 30-second sound bites on the news. So this week I thought we would jump into all of the bills that are floating around that address the governor's emergency. As you know, was in March of last year, so was it 15 months ago, the governor used Chapter 12 law to award himself unilateral lawmaking authority, these emergency powers that were supposed to be for fires and floods, he used for a public health crisis and a public health emergency, declared an emergency, and he can now and has been writing law unilaterally. After 30 days, his emergency is only good for 30 days. He has to renew it. And the state statute says that the legislature has it must be given the ability to end his emergency if they choose. The way that it's written is a legislative veto. It means both bodies must, overturn his powers. So if one body doesn't, like the Minnesota House, then he gets to retain his powers. That type of legislative veto has been ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court back in the 80s. Many states have got rid of this legislative veto in much of their legislation. Minnesota has not. And so there are many bills. In fact, they were introduced right away to fix that provision of Chapter 12, to make the legislature not veto it, but force them to vote to extend. And if both bodies don't vote to extend it, then the emergency should die. So that was offered right away by Jerry Hertas. It was part of the legislation we've been working on, but it doesn't go far enough, because there's a big loophole in that where the governor can give himself the powers, and then on day 29, he can end his emergency, which cancels all the executive orders, the mask mandates, everything else. And then a minute later, he can reissue another emergency and all of the executive orders. So in other words, he can bypass the legislature. And Keith Ellison actually spoke to that possibility when the governor did not want to call the legislature back into special session to vote on his emergency. So we need to fix that too. And of course, in our lawsuit against the governor last year, one of the things was that the Minnesota state constitution prohibits one branch of government from delegating its authority to another branch. So the legislature should not be able to delegate lawmaking authority to the governor, even temporarily. Whatever we allow him to do could be some rulemaking or something, but it can't be enforced by law. And Chapter 12 says that the emergency orders have the full force of law. So in other words, that is unconstitutional. We need to fix that. And so much of what we've been working on came out of our lawsuits. And so during special session, we introduced a bill to change a bunch of stuff, and we can get into the details of that. But of course, we're kind of being attacked because Eric Mortensen and we authored together legislation. I'm a co-author on it to change a bunch of stuff and basically eliminate Chapter 12 and force the legislature to be the only ones that could declare an emergency. So where do you want to start, Walter? I hope I explained kind of the emergency powers. Do you have questions that I left out on things?
No, it's a pretty decent overview, and it's difficult for me to, at this point, put myself in the position of somebody who doesn't understand it or know what's going on, since I've been following it pretty closely. Um, but I think that's a pretty fair summary for people who might be coming in fresh, not knowing exactly what it is that we're deliberating here. But yes, there are two different bills, unless there's been a third or fourth one that I'm unaware of, that have been introduced. The first, of course, being Mortenson's bill that was introduced during the normal session, and the second one being your guys' bill, the New House Republican Caucus bill, that has been introduced during the special session. And as you have explained before, legislation that was introduced during the regular session is no longer part of the process. It has to be reintroduced now, which kind of raises a question, pops into my head as I'm saying it. Has there been an effort to introduce Mort's bill in this special session?
I have not seen it introduced. I mean, let's just back up. So there's been multiple bills. It wasn't just Mort's bill. There's been a lot of bills introduced that alter Chapter 12. And it's also really important for listeners to know, back in like 2002, Republicans saw Chapter 12 as an opportunity for the governor to kind of give himself long-term unilateral authority during a public health crisis. And we already had a chapter of law called Chapter 144, which addresses public health crises. It allows the Commissioner of Health to do things like quarantining people. Basically, when there's outbreaks of a communicable disease, like the hepatitis C outbreak that was in Mankato, they can mobilize the National Guard. They can set up tents. They can quarantine people that are healthy. They can isolate people that are sick and deal with a localized outbreak. And anytime that the Commissioner of Health wants to do something under Chapter 144, she has to go to a court and petition the court for approval to infringe on someone's civil liberties. Now, I hate, as somebody that fights for civil liberties all the time, I hate the sound of that. But you have to agree that during a crisis like that, somebody's walking around with a communicable disease that could be threaten millions of people. There is a time where you have to figure out how to isolate that person, and it's better to have the court of law do it, because they, under Chapter 144, must use the least restrictive means test. So in other words, if she wants to come in and quarantine a whole city, the judge may say, no, you can't, but you can do, the nursing home and the staff or something more restrictive. And so that chapter of law is already there. Republicans put in place in Chapter 12 a clarification that if it's a public health emergency, all of these emergency powers must be handled under 144. In other words, the commissioner has to go to the courts, and of course the commissioner can be fired by the Senate, right? So there's all three branches of government are working there. It's really good. So we didn't author this legislation. It was already there from back in 15, 16 years ago, or 18 years ago. But the Democrats, when that passed, put a sunset of 3 years on it. So that went away. So that provision is part of House File 28. So we're restoring that provision. But then we go further to say during a real emergency, which is a fire and flood, okay, actual natural disasters, that the governor doesn't have unilateral lawmaking authority, and that he can declare an emergency for a riot or a fire, but it only can last up to 5 days. And the legislature must then, approve it after 5 days. And he doesn't have the full force of law. He can't. So it really addresses real emergencies, because what we found, and one of the problems with Mortenson's bill, was that all the federal statutes around emergency management require the governor to declare an emergency. And had Mortenson went through House research, where you submit an idea to House research, they do all the research with all the statutes, line it all up, make sure that your bill doesn't just change this, but then he'll come back and say, oh, well, if you're going to change this, you have to figure out what you want to do over here. Do you want to do this or this? He gives you options, and then, the bill grows and grows. Mortenson, he bypassed research and had some friend on the outside write a bunch of stuff, and he just submitted it and put jackets on it. So it's a little embarrassing for people like me that signed on, because if his bill were to get a hearing, they would just eviscerate it, because they'd say, look, all the federal funds and aligning with federal, law and FEMA and all this stuff, we would be disqualified in Minnesota because the governor, under this law, couldn't even declare an emergency for a fire or a flood or a tornado. And plus, so it does cause a lot of problems that we would hope to clean up in another version.
So let me ask you this, because that is one of, if not the most prominent points of contention between supporters of Mort's bill and the bill that you're currently signed onto in the special session, is this difference between having the legislature declare an emergency, which is what Mort's bill would do, and having the governor declare an emergency, which your bill would continue to allow, albeit significantly differently than has been done over the course of the past 18 months. And we'll get into what those differences are. You've already touched upon it. But so what would be so terrible about the legislature being the source of a declaration? Sure, you wouldn't have access to federal resources, but we're conservatives. We don't like marble cake federalism. We don't like the federal government getting involved in our business. So what would be so terrible about having to cough up our own funds to take care of our own emergencies here in Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean I would agree with the FEMA side of things. I mean, I hate FEMA and how they do things. I hate a lot of what they do, especially when you're in Minnesota. We live here, and we see hurricanes hit the same part of Florida every year, and people get bailouts of all their house, their homeowners insurance isn't absolutely atrocious because FEMA covers the first $250,000 of it, and it's frustrating. But we do have floods and fires and tornadoes here where whole groups of people are impacted, whole communities are decimated, and without federal funds, or if we were to pay into a state fund instead, that might be fine. But the way it is now, we just so many laws would have to be changed if we want to coordinate with the federal government. It's if saying, well, Mortensen's bill could go into effect, but it would take an act of Congress, it kind of prevents us from actually putting in legislation that's sound. I agree that the legislature should be involved. So the governor can declare it, but if he doesn't get any powers by declaring it, then it doesn't mean anything. And so he can have this, stupid title to declare, like when the Wisconsin governor had his powers taken away from him by the Supreme Court. They realized all of the federal funds shut off for disaster relief for Wisconsin. So the legislature gave him the ability to declare an emergency, but he got no powers. And so that's what our bill does. It lets him declare an emergency, but the legislature has to basically reaffirm everything that he wants to do within 5 days. And keep in mind, we could have an emergency in the wintertime where it's like, complete freeze, like 40 below zero, and the roads are impassable. We get, 8 feet of snow. And I believe that, our state constitution requires that we have a quorum in the seat of government, which is St. Paul. I don't like the Zoom legislature. And so if we have to get to St. Paul within 6 hours to declare an emergency, or the feds can't come in and help, or whatever has to happen that in the state, then what's, it's kind of impossible. We need one person to declare an emergency just to get the ball rolling, but he can't write law. He can't throw people in jail. He can't fine people. And my other concern about the legislature declaring the emergency is that, keep in mind, I think his bill says 3/5 majority has to, or 2/3.
2/3.
That 2/3. That would require that, all these liberal Democrats would have to declare an emergency when there's a flood in the Red River Valley, when they want police reforms. And so they can start holding legislation hostage and saying, well, gee, I'd love to declare an emergency for, deep red Minnesota, but we want this. And we should also bail out the Minneapolis, when the federal funds come in and they say, well, you would get money if we declared an emergency, but we want money for Lake Street, And so you start, I just don't see it as being a workable solution for real emergencies. It was really hard for me to read Cal's bill and not take the public health stuff out of there. Because when it comes down to it, and fires and floods and a refinery exploding and stuff, I think we do want the governor to be able to quickly respond. It's something the legislature just can't do. But it's the public health crisis stuff that could be forever. And that we need to take out of Chapter 12. And if you look at how our laws were written with Chapter 144, that's exactly where it belongs. And it has all 3 branches of government involved in the decision making.
So the interactions that I've seen and been a part of online debating these two bills and the merits of each of them have been fascinating because, first of all, and maybe not everybody who's engaged in this debate agrees, but I see it as an argument, a friendly argument amongst people who are on the same side. I mean, none of us want to see a repeat of what we've experienced over the course of the past 18 months. My objective is to indeed never again have the governor assume dictatorial authority, basically replace our Republican form of government with a monarchy and be the one guy in charge of everything for an indefinite period of time. What I find interesting is that the opposition to Cal's bill, to the bill that you're supporting in the special session, is I'm trying to be generous in terms of how I describe this criticism, but it's I'll just say it seems to be misrepresenting what it is that the bill does, because they're arguing that that the governor gets to keep his emergency powers. He gets to keep his capacity to declare an emergency, which is true. He gets to declare an emergency, but an emergency under this bill that's being considered is not the same thing as the emergency that we just experienced over the course of the past 18 months. It's a completely different animal. This redefines how emergencies work, how they get sustained, and the checks and balances that currently don't exist and haven't existed over the course of the past 2 years are instituted in a vigorous and comprehensive way that brings the legislature into it and holds elected officials accountable and really hobbles the executive authority that the governor has enjoyed over the course of the past couple of years. And so I'm interested in going through. There's a piece here that a mutual friend of ours posted from North Star Liberty Alliance where they break down the details of the differences between the two bills, and I'm interested in getting your response to the claims that they make.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
So
I talked to Bill for an hour on the phone the other day too to try to, because I just want to, before you get started on that, the legislative process is collaborative, right? You introduce a bill and you look for sponsors when you introduce it. Otherwise, people can sign on once you've introduced it, and then you get feedback from people and say, okay, let's do another version. Let's amend it when it gets a hearing, and you take all this feedback, and a lot of it is good, and you try to make a better bill. If we didn't want to introduce a bill that was bad or flawed. We know we're not going to get a hearing on it right away. So we wanted to, sit and work on it. We've been bouncing it back and forth for months on how to make a better bill. But certainly, I mean, I reached out to Bill to get feedback from him on how to make this a better bill. And we kind of went round and round on stuff, but go ahead and fire his first claim on this.
yeah, these are going to be his shots that I'm firing. I'm playing the devil's advocate here. So I'll just start off reading it. He writes, the new House Republican caucus is trying to cheat by copying Representative Eric Mortenson's homework. Somehow, when they turned it in, Mort got an A+, while the NHRC got an F. So there's a lot of editorializing here in these first few paragraphs. Just today, Cal Barr introduced a fake end emergency powers reform bill, which is co-sponsored by Representatives Lucero, Mecklin, Drazkowski, Munson, and Miller. Looking to confuse their conservative constituents, they titled HF 28 the Never Again bill, which carries the same name as Mortenson's superior legislation to try and dupe their constituents. Now, so let's speak to this first, kind of this sort of strategic complaint. They're crying foul because you're using the name Never Again. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if you look up House File 2204 on the Minnesota, if you go to house.mn and you look it up, and you look at his bill and you see how it's introduced, the title of his bill it says this act may be cited as the, quote, Unilateral Emergency Powers Repeal Act. That's the title of the bill under the Section 1 title, which is true. Our bill is entitled the Never Again Bill, but this Never Again name came from Jake Duesenberg. It is a great branding item. And we have been struggling over the past year when we talk about what we want to do to end the emergency. We had two things going. We had We had a movement in the House to actually end the emergency, which would end all the executive orders because people were feeling pain from those. But we also wanted to end his emergency powers under Chapter 12. And we've realized that it is so confusing to talk about the two because he has executive orders, which people call the emergency powers, right? And we wanted to actually end the real ones that matter, which is Chapter 12. And Duesenberg came up with this idea of saying, well, just call it we want this to never happen again. And to say it in 2 words, never again, is a great summary of everything we want to do. It is the difference between ending the emergency, which we're also working on, which will probably be successful on this week, and the other part, which is never again. So yes, we called it the never again bill because that's what differentiates our bill from almost all of the other bills, is because it actually prevents the governor from doing it again. And that's what people should want, not just ending the current emergency. So I'm gonna give him technically we didn't steal the title because his title was different, but this name, never again, is what this bill does. And that is, We're going to be in the same category.
So, and it to me, they call it petty, the fact that you called it the never again bill. If it's a petty point, it's petty either way, right? I mean, it was mine. It was my name. I get the name. It's, come on, guys. Let's be a little bit more serious in terms of the substance of what we're deliberating. So the first substantive thing that I see here that they get into in terms of criticizing the never again bill, as officially titled in the special session, is they claim that it legitimizes Governor Walz's tyranny. And this is quoting, they say, Barr's bill reintroduces key provisions from the since modified 2002 law, which you spoke of earlier, which vastly expanded the governor's authority in a public health emergency. The Minnesota Health Emergency Powers Act allowed the governor to act like a tyrant when he or she deemed fit. Specifically, this law allowed the governor to, 1, issue edicts that carry the full force and rule of law, 2, have full control over building occupancy, 3, have full control over public and private transportation, 4, commandeer private property, and 5, limit or eliminate funerals and visitations. This law is where Governor Walz derives much of his modern day power, despite its questionable standing with the Minnesota Constitution. Representative Duke Powell made many modifications to this law when he introduced HF 1555. His proposal kept some of the worst provisions that Walz has taken advantage of, though it was a slight improvement over the 2002 law. More specifically, the new law eliminated allowances of public health emergency declarations, expands the legislature's ability to end a declared peacetime emergency, expands the governor's ability to issue rules, orders during any peacetime emergency. You see, the governor has not had the ability to declare a peacetime emergency in the name of public health since former Representative Duke Powell passed his bill eliminating its definition. If the NHRC successfully reintroduces a public health emergency declaration under Chapter 12, Walz would be free to continue on his executive tirade against the liberties of Minnesotans. True or false?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important to know that Chapter 144 law, which is where our bill directs public health crises, already exists. So the law is already there. A governor could have last March had the commissioner of health under Chapter 144. He could have declared a public health emergency or a public emergency, and then had the governor work on or had the commissioner of health go to the courts and say, we want to put restrictions on nursing homes, because the commissioner of health does oversee nursing homes. And she could have done all these things and went to the courts and petitioned them for basically what she wanted to do for locking people down. It was much easier for the governor to just use Chapter 12 and write everything himself and do everything like a tyrant. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where his claims are. I mean,
the way I read it is they're saying that by reintroducing because the bill, your bill, defines a public health emergency. And so by defining public health emergency in the law, it creates a legitimacy for such an emergency. And they're pointing to that and saying, aha, this is something that going forward, the governor is going to be able to do, is to be able to declare that there is, in fact, a public health emergency. Therefore, I get to do whatever I want, essentially.
Well, I mean, the Never Again bill is about preventing the governor from ruling and doing things unilaterally. It is not about preventing a virus from outbreaking again, right? We have to admit that there is going to be in the future some other communicable disease that's going to outbreak, whether it's a city or a restaurant has a Hep C outbreak or something happens where we need public health officials to, help us figure out what to do and how to contain this thing. That I think that's going to happen at some point. What we don't want is we don't want a seasonal influenza outbreak to happen, which it happens almost every year, to occur this fall and have two children die in a school and have the governor decide he's going to do a statewide mask mandate and, you know, basically push that out statewide. That's what we don't want to have happen again, and that's why it's so important that we put into law the framework that restricts the governor's executive authority. We want to restrict the governor from having unilateral lawmaking authority. We don't want to handicap the entire government for all emergencies. And I think that even when we're talking with Scott Jensen, we have to admit that there are some things that we want the government to be able to step in and change. Some, and this is like changing rules that we have preventing, semi trucks from going down certain roads if they're over a certain weight. The governor should be able to change that during an emergency unilaterally. It's not a law. It's just a rule that he's suspending or giving an allowance for until the legislature can actually pass it into law.
Right.
I mean, talking with Bill Paulson, where he said, look, we're going to have a court of law that has the authority to infringe on your civil liberties. Well, and he wants the legislature, to be in charge of that. Well, you know what, Bill? The legislature infringes on your civil liberties all the time, right? The legislature passes gun control. That infringes on your civil liberties, and they do it. It's a violation of the Constitution, but they still do it. Every part of government has the ability to infringe on your civil liberties. It's just that we don't want the governor, one person, to have that authority. We want it to go through, a lot of checks and balances that we should have. We want, if the commissioner of health is petitioning a court, they're not going to be going against the governor. They're going to be pre-authorizing something, which is the easiest way for them to say no. And if it's put in place and they don't like it, the Senate can fire the commissioner. The governor could change commissioners, can appoint a different commissioner, and the courts are involved. So the legislature, the executive branch, and the courts are all involved in these decisions for public health. And yes, it does keep in place Chapter 12, which is what they said it expands it. Well, it keeps Chapter 12 in place, which is for real emergencies. It severely restricts his ability to rule unilaterally. There's no lawmaking authority whatsoever, no fines and stuff. And it does expand it because it it adds a public health crisis or public health emergency language and says, if public health emergency, see Chapter 144. This is where you go for that.
Right. Yeah, right. And that's just it. Is the complaint is, well, you're defining a public health emergency that wasn't previously defined in statute, or it was, but that statute expired at sunset. And so now you're reintroducing this definition, and that's creating a hazard because now the governor can appeal to that. But that's not correct. The governor can't appeal to that and say, now I get to do whatever I want. The definition is put there in a context of a bill that is designed specifically to direct that circumstance away from the governor and say, no, you can't do this. This is something that has to be handled in a very particular way. You go through, and I looked at this today. You look at the text of the bill, Section 2, which is the first section after the title, lays out the rights of citizens, noting nothing in this chapter authorizes the governor or the state director to suspend the rights of people within the borders of Minnesota, including but not limited to the right of free speech, the right to practice one's religion, the right to assemble, the right to keep and bear arms, the freedom of travel, and most importantly, the right to operate a business lawfully as determined by the laws prior to the emergency.
Yeah. So I need to hang on. I need to stop you there because that section was in Mort's bill. Those are the only lines that we took from Mort's bill, because we believe that it's already in the Constitution, that you don't need to lay this out. But based on what the courts have been ruling in this past year, we like the fact that he has this protection of citizens' rights. So all of those words that you just read that just right off the bat say nothing in this chapter out. Those are from Mort's bill. And those are the only lines from Mort's bill, except for the last one where you said the right to operate a business. Mort's bill just said the right to operate a business or earn an income. And when we ran this through the revisers, he's like, well, or the research guy, he's like, well, this would basically negate if during a time of emergency, drug dealers could argue that they have a right to earn income. So we must put in place under the laws previous to the emergency. But the citizens' rights protections that are in here, this is what Mort's bill contributed to this, and what makes it very clear right from the get-go that we're not infringing on people's rights.
Well, and that's the problem that I have with the analysis that the critics of this bill are offering, is that they're ignoring vital definitional context and pretending that it doesn't exist, and saying, "Oh, look, see, it puts public health emergency back into law." Yeah, it puts in a definition in order to specify that under these circumstances, this is what you can't do. Under these circumstances, this is what you must do. This is the process that you have to go through, the hoops you have to jump through. It's very specific and it leaves no ambiguity. And so, I'm left wondering to what extent this can be explained by, on the one hand, a lack of knowledge of how law works, kind of what you were saying earlier regarding the legislative research that goes into looking at a proposed bill and its language and comparing it against current statute and saying, hey, here's what you're missing, or here's what you're neglecting to account for, versus not wanting to deal with the substance at issue. And, I don't want to impugn people's motives, but it's really bizarre to me that when you start off your attack complaining about they took the name of our bill, and the first 3, 4, 5 paragraphs of your article are a bunch of editorializing about real conservatives and fake conservatives and all this impugning of your motives. It's tough to take the following analysis, the analysis that comes after that, with a whole lot of grace.
Well, and that I've had a lot of people reach out to me too and say, what gives? Because I looked at your bill and I saw the scan through it and it looks good, and I don't understand what everybody's upset about, but we just don't want the governor to do that again. And I'm like, this
Right.
bill is an improvement, a much better improvement and legitimate. But one of the things it doesn't do, and I had this out with Bill, is this bill doesn't specifically say if the governor violates people's rights that he goes to jail, and fines them. And so, I also want to get this bill into law, and the governor would never sign a bill into law saying that, putting him at risk of going to jail. It's all just kind of haphazard, but basically what my first argument was, who's going to enforce it? Keith Ellison? Is he going to put the governor in jail? Is he going to fine the governor? Because I don't see him doing that, but it makes it so politically charged, and it does rally the conservative base to say, and the governor will go to jail if he violates it. Well, it's in law already. It's in our Constitution what the governor can do, and so I think it's important to say let's get a bill through that's proper and just, and isn't just politically charged, and say we're going to throw the governor in jail if he violates a section. Right. It's already against the law for what he would do.
What occurs to me as I consider the arguments being offered by some of these critics is that it starts to border on the absurd, because the argument that I'm hearing is you have to be super aggressive with the language that you put in this legislation. You have to take away the ability for the governor to declare an emergency of any kind, and you have to have these criminal penalties instituted within the law. Otherwise, it's going to be too weak. And when you ask, well, what do you mean by too weak? Like, what standard are you using to determine that? And they'll say, well, look at what he did last time. None of this stuff was legal to begin with, and he just ignored the law and did whatever he wanted, which is true. I mean, you and I have talked about that here on the program, about how the letter of the law did not allow for what Tim Walz did. And yet, the courts didn't see it that way. And so here we are. But if that's the case, if that's the situation that we find ourselves dealing with, to where it doesn't matter what the law says at all, then what's the point of having this argument? What does it matter if Mort's bill passes versus the NHRC bill? Either way, if the underlying issue is that we don't live in a republic and nothing the legislature does matters, then what is it? How much is giving the legislature more power going to have the effect that you intend? So I mean, it occurs to me that there has to be a baseline assumption that the law you're writing and the law you're trying to pass is actually going to be followed. Like that, you have to proceed with that assumption. You can't start building the assumption that the law isn't going to be followed into your deliberation over what that law ought to be.
Yeah.
Do you see it differently?
No, you're right, and I've long said that too. Where people are, I mean, when I'm in the legislature, we're in committee, and a bill comes through, and I'm like, well, we should actually button up this language because it's too broad. We need to do this. We need to do this, and people are like, well, they know what our intent is. Like, no, that doesn't matter. You have to also go by what it says in the letter of the law. And this chapter 12, as it exists today, says act of nature, which Walz is saying it's a virus. He's stretching that, but then it also says that it must endanger life and property. A virus does not endanger property, never has. And so you could argue that the way it was written, the Mort's bill or whatever, would say the governor doesn't have the authority because it was when we wrote it, we said life and property and not just endangers life. But you're right, he's not going to follow the law anyways. So a lot of this is moot. I mean, we can try to be as clear as possible, and especially in response to this abuse of powers, writing this to make sure that it's called the Never Again bill. So presumably 10 years from now, when this happens again and the governor thinks he has the authority into this and saying, no, this was written specifically so that this could never happen again. It's that clear. And hopefully some legislative intent would be taken into consideration by the courts in addition to the language being clear, and we can prevent this from happening again. But the bottom line is we shouldn't be electing a governor that would threaten our liberty like this. And so I'm hopeful that we can get a governor in here that's actually going to follow the Constitution.
Well, and a couple other points on that. One, there's a pretty significant difference between getting cute with what the word "and" means in the law and interpreting it improperly, as you and I believe it was, and ignoring whole cloth the details of what this Never Again bill says in regards to where the authority lies between the three branches of government. I mean, it's very explicit what the governor gets to do, what the legislature gets to do in response to affirmation or rejection of what the governor has declared, and then the role that the courts play as well. None of that is currently present under the status quo. This is a substantial and significant change to existing law. The other thing that strikes me as being problematic with the notion of putting in criminal penalties for the governor is I don't think that holds constitutional muster. That strikes me as a violation of the separation of powers. There's a reason why you have to go through an impeachment proceeding for an executive, because you can't just arrest him, right? Like you can't, the idea that the legislature can pass a law that results in the governor being arrested, you're canceling out a third of government. You're canceling out the executive branch by doing that. That you can't do that. There have to be impeachment proceedings. It has to be a political process. And so that goes back to that research aspect that you were talking about earlier. Is it's great to have these ideas, and I'm all about fleshing them out in public as we're doing now and having a deliberation and talking about it. But the hubris of saying, here's my text, me and my buddies wrote it, and you're either going to vote for it as is or you're a rhino. It's just stupid. It's just dumb to say, to pretend that that's how anything works. There is going to be valid criticism of any text that you bring to the table, and you're going to have to take that into consideration in terms of how this interacts with existing law and what the effect of it is going to be.
Yeah, and the way the legislature works is, we introduce competing bills or different bills, and when somebody gets a hearing, usually the committee chair would say, you know what, we're going to have a hearing on 4 different emergency powers bills, and maybe we go with this one, maybe we go with that one, and at that point, Mort can put an amendment on ours, or we could, like you can amend bills to make them better. That's what you're supposed to do in committee, anyways. Hear testimony, talk about it, try to amend bills, make them better. I also feel like part of this conversation we should talk about just the way that they're going about pushing this bill and rallying the base. Part of the confrontational politic model isn't about winning; it's about losing. Like they purposely want to lose to build the base, to have an outcome, to have a campaign outcome. We're trying to legislate. We're actually trying to change the law. And so we also need to work on legislation that's going to be acceptable to all parties and to explain to them why this is a win. Mort's bill is one of those bills that's not really constitutional. They don't even want, they wouldn't want a hearing on it because it would be eviscerated. They know it's going to fail, but it's a good campaign issue. It's a good fundraising issue, and that serves a purpose too. It gets people involved, and they have done a fantastic job at marketing. That's one thing Jake and Tony do well is this. Getting people there, getting people to protest, getting people to call your legislator. That's great, and that's why I think the confrontational politics model is effective to get people engaged. But we also need to, be honest about this legislation. This is good.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly with those strategic goals, right? And we've talked about that. I've talked about it elsewhere as well. The importance of planting a flag and saying this is where I stand, win, lose, or draw. This is the way things ought to be. But you can only do that when you're actually standing on something that is substantive and that actually upholds the principle that you're espousing. And I don't think that's the case with the provisions of this bill that are in dispute. There is no conservative principle that requires us to dispense with executive emergencies whole cloth. There's no conservative principle that says that we have to have criminal penalties in there for the governor if he violates somebody's rights. That's not a issue of conservative principle or a hill that one even could die on if they tried. Like I say, it gets to the point of absurdity where you're no longer arguing over whether or not the governor ought to have the power to do what he did over the past 18 months. You're arguing over whether or not the solution that you've proposed for it should just be accepted as is without any sort of critique, alteration, or deliberation or input of any kind, and then calling anybody who dares to do that, who dares to suggest, well, this might not have arrived perfect on my desk. Let's talk about some details as to how we can get this to work. To your point about legislating, if the case from the other side was, well, we don't care whether or not this gets done because it's the right thing to do, and they could actually make a defensible case that it was the right thing to do, then I would be arguing their side rather than yours. But that's not the case. What they're saying is you should do this because it's the right thing to do, but then they're not able to substantiate why. They come up with these objections that under scrutiny fall apart. The idea that there's no rightful place for emergency powers in the executive branch, the idea that the legislative branch ought to be able to cancel out the executive with criminal penalties that circumvent the impeachment process. These are ideas that are completely outside the bounds of what government constitutionally may do. I just don't understand where the principles are at stake here.
Well, one of the other concerns that I wanted to make sure was in this legislation, and I worked with Cal on some different revisions. When the governor locked the state down, I went to a local city council that I knew was conservative and said, "Hey guys, you guys should pass what Texas did, which is a business sanctuary, economic sanctuary city, and say that we're open. We're going to disregard the governor's emergency. We're open." And they were going to pass this ordinance or resolution. And then their city attorney got upset because they said, if we do this and somebody dies, then we're going to be responsible. We could be held, civilly liable. So I wanted to make sure that there was some immunity in the bill for businesses that wanted to be open. And so that's why we wrote this citizen's responsibility in an emergency. It basically, and it sounds pretty harsh when you read it, but it basically says, if you're a business and you're open, you take on responsibility. Now, this is not public health crisis. This is during a fire or flood. But if they wanted to be open or do something, they take on responsibility of their patrons if they get injured because of the flood or whatever. And so it was really shielding the cities and local governments so that if they wanted to go against the orders, or if you say, you know what, you have a right to do business during an emergency, but you take on some civil liability of people that you're, serving. And so that was important to write this legislation there so that we didn't have a conflict between local government or state government, and we could actually say you have a right to operate your business. The commissioner of health couldn't make an argument, or the governor could make an argument on why he should have the authority to restrict people's civil liberties. But we've vetted so many different emergencies through this bill to see how it would work, and that's because we have to anticipate people are going to pick it apart if we actually get a hearing on this. And that's what it's important. You want to defend your bill.
Yeah, and you have to have rational answers to those questions. You can't just keep appealing to rhetoric and calling everybody names and saying everybody's a statist or a rhino or whatever epitaph you're going to throw at them. You have to have an argument at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, so we have a significant amount of people that have signed on to the bill already. Let me just look at the list of authors here on the bill in the House. And again, I'm a co-author on both Mort's bill and Cal's bill. So I've had a lot of input on Cal's bill, and we've been working on stuff. But there's 13 authors as of today, and it's the 23rd. And then in the Senate, I think there's a few authors on the Senate version, 3 authors. So we've got 16 House and Senate authors on these bills. And more people are reading it, and they may sign on during the special session, but I anticipate we're going to be offering another version, maybe even before the end of the session if we get constructive feedback from people and we need to make changes. But so far, people's feedback has been mostly positive. So except for the attacks from Bill Paulson and Action for Liberty. And then, we are working with our friends in the Senate to try to get this, to the table as far as the negotiation. People say, well, Tim Walz is never going to sign this. And I said, well, you know what? Tim Walz is going to be out campaigning, and he's going to run into a lot of people who say, I voted for you the first time, but, you shut my hair salon down. Shame on you. He should be able to say, you know what? I understand your concerns, but understand we've taken care of this. I signed legislation into law that gave up my powers to do this so that it can't happen again. I want to get, it's my guarantee to you. So I'm not trying to help Tim Walz's campaign, but I am trying to say that there's a reason that he would like this, like that he would sign it.
Well, and even if he won't, that's where I would take the other side of the argument and say the point of putting this forward is not to get Tim Walz to sign it. I mean, that'd be nice. But the point is to say this is the way things ought to be. We're putting this flag in the ground and saying this is where we stand. I'm all for that. I'm all for taking a stand regardless of what the legislative outcome is. But the stand damn well ought to make sense. That's the only stipulation that I have, is that it ought to be a sound stand that is defensible, and I think this is.
Yeah, and so I mean, if we can get this, and we've had a lot of people in the Senate reading this and talking it through and supposedly having conversations with leadership over there. But if we have a sound bill that the Senate would hear in committee, I mean, we have a good chance of us being heard in the Senate. And then we could actually have, people come to the table, the emergency management people from the county, health officials, to talk about how this would work and figure out if there's any criticism on it that we need to put into the bill. So, I mean, I think there's a real shot at getting a hearing at least. And there's also a possibility that Governor Walz may feel the pressure that he needs to tell people that it's not going to happen again.
Well, and regardless, the process is illuminating in terms of us having this conversation publicly and hopefully finding out where people stand on it.
What else has been happening in news this last week?
What were some of I know you had some posts this week that I responded to. I can't think of them off the top of my head. I'm trying to pull them up here.
One of the things I thought was interesting is the World Health Organization back on June 3rd listed on their website that they didn't recommend kids be vaccinated. They actually posted advice for the public getting vaccinated. Children should not be vaccinated for the moment. It said there is not yet enough evidence on the use of vaccines against COVID-19 in children to make recommendations for children to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Children and adolescents tend to have milder disease compared to adults. That was their advice. With everything else going on, and there is concerns about children having this is another site, but I'm telling with the heart conditions that children have been dying from the vaccine, it's a very low risk, but children have a very low risk of dying from COVID. So their recommendation is not to vaccinate children. And oh my gosh, did the liberal sphere just blow up when Munson and thousands of others posted this on social media, and Facebook sent out the Facebook police to what does it say here? It's like they had to claim that it's misleading.
Right.
Was there? Yeah. It says
Yep.
independent checkers say that this information could mislead people.
Yeah.
It's not that it's wrong. I'm linking directly to their site, but it says that it could mislead people.
Well, this is not a unique phenomenon. I experienced this with another podcast that I participate in, where we got banned from YouTube. We had one of our episodes taken down and a strike placed against our channel. Why? For exactly the same reason, because we quoted two mainstream, highly respectable sources. The first was the U.S. Census, and the second was the Pew Research Center. And the census said that there was a certain number of voters who participated in the 2020 election, and the Pew Research Center said that there was a certain number of ballots that were counted in that election, and those two numbers didn't match. They were off by 4 million more ballots than voters. Because we said that, and again, just like you're talking about here with the WHO, all we're doing is pointing to an official report and saying, that's weird. And you get fact checked. Not only was it fact checked, but they said that this is misleading, fraudulent. They use the word fraudulent, and you are engaged in deceptive practices. This is slander. This is libel. Like, at some point, this has to catch up with big tech. Like, you are to publicly put that on somebody's post, that they are being misleading and fraudulent and deceptive, especially when you're obviously lying about that because it's the WHO and all you're doing is quoting them, or it's the US Census and all you're doing is quoting them, or the Pew Research Center or whoever. There would be civil penalties for that in other contexts. And so, something needs to happen. I know this is a big controversy amongst the libertarian set as to what government's role ought to be in big tech censorship, but the status quo is not acceptable. You can't have what's the equivalent of the phone company picking up the line as a third party in your conversation and saying, actually, Billy is wrong about what he just said. That's not a role that they get to play.
Yeah. Well, I think it should be embarrassing for Facebook to. I've seen some fact checks that are like way off. Like when you post something and it says this is proven wrong, and it's like the article it links to has nothing to do with what you posted. But,
that's right.
But this was actually the World Health Organization. It's their website. It's not some crazy website. I go out of my way to not post. I haven't posted anything from Breitbart or the far right magazines. Because I go out of my way actually to find, if I find an article that I like on a conservative news thing, I go out and find something on, NPR or MSNBC, and then I can post my commentary with that article. But if I can show facts from a left-leaning magazine, it leaves people without an argument that try to come at me. Speaking of the hypocrisy on the left, on the House floor this week, we passed a bunch of omnibus bills. I voted no on every single omnibus bill because I don't like omnibus bills. But there was a energy / climate change / commerce bill that came to the floor. It was an enormous monstrosity, tons of policy, but it was packed full of green energy, solar subsidies. It accelerates the solar program in Minnesota so fast. It was hard to believe there was a Republican in the room negotiating this bill. because it was pretty gross with pork. So I've been doing a lot of research. I'm on the energy committee, and I found out that most of the solar panels that are made that are made for the U.S. market are manufactured in China, and the Chinese government has rounded up some 1 million Muslims, part of this ethnic minority called Uyghurs, and they have put them into forced labor camps, so these concentration camps, where they basically have enslaved them, and they manufacture solar panels. And as China does well, they create these little cities that this one city of 4 million makes batteries, and this city, like they have really, the government has set this up right. Well, this is the solar panel city, and they have basically pushed all these people into slavery. And so we just offered an amendment during regular session that said, we have to do a report on slavery for the Uyghurs that in the solar industry, and the Democrats accepted the amendment onto the energy bill during the regular session. But now we had an amendment that said, look, we can't mandate or use taxpayer dollars for solar panels if slave labor has been used to process, mine, manufacture, or assemble these products. And every single Democrat in the House voted against that amendment. I mean, it was a clear amendment against slavery, and it was right after it was right during Juneteenth. Right, I stood up on the House floor after they had said that they weren't going to vote for it, and said, "Look, we just celebrated Juneteenth, the emancipation of slavery. Here we are, 167 years later, and Republicans are still fighting against the Democrat support for slavery. What the hell? I can't believe they all voted against it."
Yeah, I reposted that as a mic drop moment on your part, which I definitely believe it was. I mean, yeah, it's Juneteenth, the irony. I was told that slavery was finished, that we ended it, that we should celebrate it. Well, I don't celebrate it because it hasn't ended in so many ways. This is one of the most egregious. The actual, in real time, right now, as we speak, chattel human bondage of workers in China who are producing the products that leftists love most: solar panels, electric car batteries. You talked about this in the Congo as well, and in Africa, the slave labor that takes place there. What's your priority? And it's very clear. I mean, you could infer this in a lot of ways, that the left, and in particular the Green Movement, value the earth over human life and human dignity. That is implicit in much of their argumentation and certainly in their policy prescriptions, but it doesn't get any more in your face than this right here.
Yeah. And Tim Miller did a great little video on it. He actually talked about the technology. He went back and talked about how the cotton gin was technology at the time that drastically accelerated cotton production and fueled slavery. And then talked about the technology of solar panels and electric cars, and how this new and exciting technology is also fueling slavery, because they just can't process or mine or do whatever they have to do through automation, or not, they can't pay regular wages, or they can't pay wages. And so, there's people, I've had people say, well, this bill creates a solar manufacturer in Minnesota. No, it doesn't. It creates an assembly. Like, they buy all the materials from China, and they just put the panels in aluminum frames, but they're not actually mining and processing and manufacturing and melding these materials. Most of the manufacturing is done in China because they have virtually no environmental restrictions whatsoever. I mean, there is stuff where we mine stuff here, send it over to China, they process it, they ship it back, and then we assemble it, right? And we say made in America. It was all the dirty work was done in China, and it's because they have no environmental standards. And so you want to talk to an environmentalist about shipping something overseas using heavy, light crude or whatever they use in those ships, and all the environmental waste that goes into play, and the human atrocities that happen. And so I'm shining the spotlight on this. This is all I've been doing for 3 years on the Energy Committee, is talking about slavery. And it's finally catching some traction, but Yeah, the media didn't cover it. Blois Olson didn't cover it in his morning take. It was just energy bill passed, and all of the lobbyists for green energy are super excited. And I talked about how solar panels are this black flag to slavery, that we're putting these solar panels on the rooftops of schools. That was part of the bill. We're gonna. It's a symbol of racism, hatred, slavery, right? That's what I want people to see. That when I drive by an industrial solar array, which people call solar gardens, out in the country in the farm fields, and I drive by, it makes me mad because I think about all the slaves that built this thing, and that we're doing nothing but funding it and using taxpayer dollars to do that. It's terrible.
Yeah. Well, and it's a monument to political grandstanding. That's really what it is. You claim to have all of these ideals and principles surrounding the green movement and green ideology, but you're not actually serving any of those principles in practical reality through this. You're going against them, as you say, by shipping materials back and forth unnecessarily, using non carbon neutral methods. And then to top it off, you're fueling and perpetuating this system of slavery and, by your own logic, environmental degradation taking place in China. And I guess as long as we're not doing it here and it's happening somewhere else, that somehow magically makes it moral, magically makes it good and above board. And your purpose in doing all of that is so that you could pat yourself on the back and, clink a toast at cocktail parties and congratulate yourself for, being progressive. Well, you're not.
Yeah. Well, I hope that the media starts reporting on this. And I did a long opinion piece to the Star Tribune 2 years ago. They were pretty excited to run it. It was a long, like 600 or 700 word opinion piece about the green energy supply chain, and I actually used the words green energy science denier, which I love to call out the liberals on. But they ran it, and I think it was a good article. We also passed the omnibus transportation bill today. This bill was, billions of dollars in funding. But one of the things that was missing from this bill was it did not restrict the governor's ability to implement California car standards in Minnesota. I don't know if you've heard about this, but he wants to follow California and basically restrict auto dealers on the assortment of cars that they can sell. They basically saying that the auto dealers in Minnesota must sell X amount of electric vehicles. This is the average mile per gallon they must get. And he's following what California has implemented. But the number one selling car in California is the Honda Civic. The number one selling car in Minnesota is the Ford F-150. So we have different vehicles. We have different weather and different needs. And yeah. I have great heartburn. And the only reason the governor it's gone to the courts, and the courts have ruled the governor has the ability to do this unilaterally. And it's because the Republicans in the House and Senate gave Pawlenty permission to implement his own, environmental standards back when he was, all excited about wind and solar. So it's come back to bite us for what Republicans did back then. I wasn't here, but it's horrible that the governor can do this unilaterally. We have the ability to stop it, to put through legislation saying no, but Republicans didn't dig their heels in the sand. They gave up. Presumably because Governor Walz, his standards can't go in until 2024, and Gazelka and the Republicans want to make this a big campaign issue. So we've given up, let him have it. And of course, you know how it works. He's going to get all the stuff work done, and it's not going to get rolled back, but it's going. And then so that bill passed today without that restriction. There was some good stuff in it for rural roads and such, but there's a lot of junk and pork in this enormous omnibus bill.
Well, and when we talk about planting flags and saying, this is where we stand, that's the purpose of it, right? So Gazelka telling me 2 years from now, 3 years from now, that we want, if you elect us, we're going to do X. When at no point between now and then they've actually attempted to do it. They've never passed the law. They've never even proposed it or debated it, well, then why should I believe you're serious about it? Like you need to fight for when there's a very strong possibility it won't get through in order to demonstrate to me that you're capable of fighting for it. Otherwise, I won't believe you. That's what the value and the necessity, in my view, of policy flag planting is you need to tell me what you're for and what you're willing to fight for and what hills you're willing to die on. Otherwise, I'm not going to believe you when you claim that you're willing to fight for it later.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I want to just give a wrap up on the legislative session. So we had one full week of session. The first 3 days, the minorities didn't do anything because the bills were introduced. You have to read a bill on 3 separate days before you can vote on it. So that happened the first half of the week. And then the Republicans in the House filibustered for 3 solid days. It was just nonstop filibustering to prevent a vote. And they were filibustering because they wanted, and I'm going to say they because this is Kurt Dout's caucus. Kurt Stout caucus wanted reinsurance, which we've talked about this in other shows, but it's a horrible socialist handout. The Republicans were taking turns actually standing up and saying, Hillary Clinton loves reinsurance. Tim Walz, when he was a congressman, loved reinsurance. Angie Craig loves reinsurance. Nancy Pelosi loves reinsurance. Keith Ellison, when he was a congressman, loved reinsurance. I mean, so they were trying to entice Democrats to vote for it because all of these socialists love it. Well, of course they love it because it's socialism. But they basically grandstanded for 3 days on reinsurance. Now, the conservative base was like, yeah, you don't give them anything until the governor, until the Never Again bill is passed. Or, they were very adamant about, we want to shut down until the governor gives up his authority. And that wasn't what they wanted. They just wanted reinsurance. Over the weekend, they got it, and they released the clog and passed all these enormous omnibus bills. You had most of the Republicans were voting for some of them. I mean, it was the board was very green. There was at times only 18 or 20 of us that still voted no on these bills. But since then, a lot of bills have passed, and everything is flowing forward, and we're giving up all of our leverage, and it doesn't sound like there's going to be a shutdown at all.
Well, and again, we sound like a broken record, but this tells you who's in charge in St. Paul, and it ain't you. This tells you who they listen to, and it ain't you. They don't care what the base wants. They don't care what their constituents, their activists, the board members sitting at a BPOU meeting somewhere in some rural county. Your opinion doesn't matter at all. They laugh at you when you're not looking. The only thing they care about is what the lobbyists want, what the people who are paying their bills want, and they want reinsurance, and that's what they got. The masters got what they expected from their bought and purchased and paid for representatives who you think are yours.
And another part of the agreement of the end of session that came out just in this last day is that the governor, Melissa Hortman, and Gazelka have all agreed to give away $250 million of taxpayer money as bonus checks to essential workers, for those who have worked hard over the past year in some role, some hero role. And they have decided that each one of the 3 triumvirate will each appoint 3 members to be part of this 9-person panel, where 7 out of 9 must vote on who's going to be on the essential workers list that gets the bonuses. So is it going to be the nurses union? Is it going to be the SEI, whatever, the SEIU, the service employees, people that Walz and Hortman have wronged this past year, who they need back on their side for elections? Maybe it's going to be some other unions that have been hurt. Maybe the police union. maybe Walz will feel good if he gives all the police officers $1,000 check. But either way, there's $250 million, and they're going to just sit in a circle and figure out how to spend your money. Now, the people that are non-essential, the people who were told they could not work last year, the people whose livelihoods were destroyed by Governor Walz's policies, those were non-essential. Those aren't getting anything. It's the essential workers, the people that got to keep
Yeah.
their jobs, that are going to get the bonuses.
Well, and whatever the amount of money is that they eventually send you as an essential worker, assuming you're lucky enough to be counted among them, just know that's how much they think your vote is on sale for. That's the price they think they could put on your political support. And they are either right about that or they're wrong about it. And you're the only one who can decide that.
Yeah. And a couple other pieces of legislation moving forward. So Hortman has come out and said that Walz will likely agree to give up his emergency powers, so that she's going to put it in some kind of legislation towards the end to end the current emergency. Not give up his permanent powers, but just end the emergency, because Gazelka has funded the off ramp for the eviction moratorium. They're going to evidently give like an entire year extra for people that haven't paid rent, so that you can't evict them, so long as they apply or reapply or apply again for government assistance. And let's see, the other legislation. Oh, here's an interesting one I wrote. I just introduced this today, actually. Texas passed a bill that inspired me. They said if a suppressor is made in Texas, that it can be sold in Texas, as long as, just as long as it's made in Texas, it can be sold in Texas, and the ATF doesn't need to be involved because it's not crossing state lines. So I introduced a bill in Minnesota that basically said if a suppressor is made here, we can sell it without having to get a paperwork and permission from the feds. And that would be, you can put a spin-on oil filter on the end of a gun, and it works as a suppressor. It's great for safety, for your hearing, especially if you got kids out there that you're shooting with that don't have to. I mean, you still wear ear protection, but it isn't going to damage your ears when you're shooting. So I think it's an interesting bill. Other than that, I mean, we're getting down to the end of session. I think it's going to be a negotiation for the end. The only bill that really hasn't shaken loose yet is public safety, and that's where the Democrats want a gazillion reforms to police whatever, all the rules around them, and Republicans are holding strong on not wanting to penalize their police. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but I know there's some parts of the public safety bill that are almost essential for some judicial things that have to happen. So at the very least, we'll probably have some kind of lights on bill that just passes the necessary public safety stuff, and then the police reforms will go to the next session in January, unless there's some kind of negotiation. But I hope that Gazelka doesn't give up any more ground on that.
One can hope, I suppose.
Yeah. And then after the special session's done, then we'll see who wants to run for governor, and we'll see all these candidates come out of the legislature. Gazelka, Benson, and whoever else hasn't announced yet will probably throw their hat in the ring.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Yeah, that's going back to where we started talking about Action for Liberty and North Star Liberty Alliance and these guys. They've been hammering on Jensen, and it seems like they're increasing the extent to which they're hammering on him. And the question I keep asking myself is, do they know something the rest of us don't in terms of who's going to come into this field, a candidate that they like better, whose name we would know, like an actual somebody, not just like some random mayor from somewhere who nobody's ever heard of, but like an actual name. It's going to be fascinating to see if that develops, because if the answer is no, if they don't have an alternative in mind, and it turns out at the end of the day, when all of the establishment folks throw their hats in the ring, that Jensen is in fact the best candidate from a liberty perspective, you've spent all this time trashing the guy who's your best candidate. So it's going to be interesting to see where that lands at the end of the process.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any specific knowledge, but I would say that they do have somebody that they are backing, and that person won't win, and they're not going to get the endorsement, and they're not going to run in a primary. But there is an advantage to running someone who's super conservative, who can sit on that panel and throw out those one-liners and talk about stuff that changes the rhetoric of the whole conversation, and can have an impact on the, if you get somebody up there, and I'm not saying me, but I'm saying if you get somebody hammering on solar and electric cars about being slavery with every single forum, you're out there talking about slavery. well, then the guy talking about electric cars can't talk about electric cars anymore. You know what I mean? You
Sure.
actually change, you change the direction, you change the topics. You talk about taking a stand for our state's rights or whatever. I think there's an advantage. So they might throw somebody out there who's a known candidate, but isn't going to win and doesn't have a chance of winning the general, but could change the direction of what Jensen and Gazelka and Benson are talking about on the campaign trail, and that would be an advantage.
Well, it'll be really interesting to see us. We're speaking hypothetically, of course. As you said, there's no inside knowledge of if or who such a person might be. But it would be interesting to me if such a person emerges, to what extent they are an independent thinking person where these are their ideas that they're articulating, or they just end up being a sock puppet for whatever these guys behind the scenes are telling them that they need to be out there saying. Because the thing that strikes me from this whole drama that you've been experiencing in recent weeks, in the past month or so, is that, you know, you in particular, Jeremy Munson, were the darling of Action for Liberty for a long time. And at some point, it was decided that that wasn't the case anymore. And it very much seems as though it's because you had your own thoughts and had the audacity to advocate for them without first running them by the authority of these activist groups and getting their okay to have your own ideas. And if that's the way it's going to be, then you're almost going to have some sort of sock puppet figure, because if you've got a guy, a Trump guy, you know, somebody who actually has their own ideas and is going to advocate for them forcefully, whether you agree with them or not, then good luck. Like, one of two things is either going to happen. Either you're going to have to let go and let them be who they are and support them because they're your guy, or you're going to have to turn against the person that you put up there for the purpose of trying to control the narrative. It's going to be very fascinating to see how that all plays out.
Yeah. Well, I want to give Action for Liberty a little bit of credit, because I think they've done a really good job at vetting candidates. You know, I've kicked a lot of names to them to say, hey, this person's interested in running. You know, I don't even know where they live, but people reach out to me all the time and say, hey, I want to run for office. And I'm great. Talk to them for a little bit, tell them about, you know, what the time commitment is and everything else. And then when they start talking about, you know, how they're going to be this great conservative person, I put them through the ringer, because I think Jake and Tony do a fantastic job of going through and figuring out where they stand. And then one of the most important things I think, and what I've learned, is I've had a lot of faith in some of these candidates. And then when they get to St. Paul, they just cannonball right in the swamp. And it's just like,
Sure,
that didn't take long. You know, I thought they were going to be this great conservative champion. And so they know how to go through and ask the questions to figure out how bold they're going to be. And part of that is just saying, hey, as you're a candidate, why don't you write a letter against the establishment, write a letter to the editor about how you believe this establishment policy is wrong. And if they can take that bold of a stance as a candidate, then maybe they will be a strong person in St. Paul and not be, you know, dragged into the swamp by the lobbyists. So they do a good job at that. But part of that is, you know, not controlling, but really keeping an eye on candidates. And then also as a legislator, you know, we talk strategy on stuff all the time, but I feel like everyone in our caucus can't be controlled. Nobody can be told what to do. I can't pressure anybody to do anything, and I don't try to. It's just, we're all independent thinkers. And that's kind of why we started our caucus, because we got sick of Kurt Doubt telling us what to do. And, you know, and since we've left, he's gotten even worse with people. But I think that I think Action for Liberty, and of course, it isn't just them. I work with Freedom Club. I work with the party, the state party. I work with a lot of different groups. Actually, I work with all the groups. I work with all the gun rights groups, even the ones people in St. Paul hate. But I can have conversations with everybody and talk to them about what they're advocating for, and try to get along with everybody. So it's strange to have Action for Liberty attacking me when, you know, I mean, I was actually just messaging with Jake today. So we're still in communication, but Obviously, he's frustrated, and it's not like it was before, where we could have a good conversation.
Well, and hopefully there's a point down the road where there is some sort of reconciliation or resolution, and we can all get on the same side of the line of scrimmage again, and start fighting the real bad guys. I'm always open to being told how I'm wrong, and but in order to do that, you're gonna have to have an open conversation about it, and I feel like that's not happening right now.
Yeah. Well, it's been. I think we've got enough material here for another episode, so I think we'll wrap up for this week, and we'll plan on doing another show next week at the end of the special session. Hopefully, we'll have good news on what's happened, or maybe we'll have bad news that the government's going to shut down, and all of the non-essential workers in government will be on a paid vacation, as is historically what happens. 6 weeks or 4 weeks of paid vacation, because they always end up getting paid at the end. All right. Well, thanks, Walter, for hosting another episode.